He will go first.
Great. Yeah, good afternoon. So I want to talk about the AI ecosystem in Toronto and in Canada in general. So sometimes people wonder why does Canada have such a lead in AI? And the reason goes back to the 1980s. And this is because an institute called Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, CIFAR, was investing in AI when a lot of people were turning their back on neural network research in general. So some of the researchers that were funded and actually moved to Canada for this funding include Geoffrey Hinton, Richard Sutton, and even Bengio was funded through this program. So as we mentioned in the morning session, how the AI winter hit in the 80s, and really there was a lot less interest in it, a lot less government funding for this kind of research. This program really kept the progress happening. And then eventually, decades later, it really paid off for Canada and for the whole world in general. So back in the 80s, the best we can do with AI was really classify handwritten digits, which is these days considered a very simple problem. But through the continual progress in terms of data sets, computing performance, and the fundamental algorithmic improvements that were made by the researchers I mentioned, we were able to classify much more complicated data sets, such as natural images in 2012. And since then, the field's just exploded. So by now, AI can do almost anything we can think of. So this latest example I'm showing here is AI playing really complex strategy games like Dota 2 and actually beating expert human teams. But this progress was really fast in the last 6 years, even though it was pretty slow for the 20 years prior. And as I mentioned, that's due to the compute, the basic research, and the increase in data sets. So leaders in AI, even though many of them are in industry now, in companies like Google, Facebook, and Apple, a lot of them spent time at the University of Toronto in the University of Toronto Machine Learning Group. They're still really supportive of the ecosystem, so they're a big part of the Neural Network Conference SNPs. And in order to continue this kind of progress, Canada is doubling down on investment in AI. So recently, the same CIFAR that invested in AI back in the 80s is now investing $125 million more into 3 core research institutes that are based across Canada. So one of them is the Alberta Machine Intelligence Institute, and that's led by Richard Sutton and really focused on reinforcement learning. The other one is the Montreal Institute for Learning Algorithms in Montreal, led by Professor Yoshio Bengio, and that's focused on deep learning in general. And finally, there's the Vector Institute that was launched about a year ago in Toronto that includes researchers like Richard Sutton and Geoff Hinton. And one of the primary goals of the Vector Institute is to train 1,000 graduate students a year. And to that end, they've recruited lots of new faculty and have grown a lot of new programs. And because of all this progress in basic research, the ecosystem in Toronto and in Canada in general has really exploded around AI. So that includes hundreds of new startups in lots of different sectors. That includes a lot more VC money coming in. And that also includes a lot of industries opening up research offices in Canada. So that includes up-and-coming companies like Uber, Google, Facebook, all have AI research centers in Toronto, and as well, some of them also have centers in Montreal. So why Toronto specifically, especially for startups? Toronto has 11 incubators supporting all the research coming out of the universities and the hospitals. It has the second most startups, probably right after San Francisco. It's also great for immigration, so there's lots of new talent coming into Canada from Europe and from other countries. And also, Korea has recently got involved in the ecosystem. So just this year, both LG and Samsung announced that they're opening up AI research centers in Toronto. The LG one is focused on Internet of Things, and the Samsung one is focused on AI in general. And then some of the successes in the startup community include these startups listed here. So they've gone from various stages, but some have actually grown from very small companies to Series B or later. And there's a few notable exits, including Layer 6 being acquired by one of the biggest banks in Canada for $100 million. Other sectors include manufacturing and automotive. So there's companies that are looking to improve quality control in manufacturing, and also improve legal services. So there's 2 startups in that space. And also a lot of AI for enterprise. So companies like Element AI and Integrate AI are really trying to improve customer relation systems and things like that for enterprise. A field I'm passionate about is AI in healthcare and AI in pharma. And because Toronto also has a very strong research community in healthcare and in biological sciences, many of the notable pharmaceutical AI companies across the world are actually started in Canada. So a few that I'd like to mention are Deep Genomics and Atomwise. So these are probably 2 of the more well-known companies from that ecosystem. They've both gone on to raise significant Series A's. Meta, my colleague is here, used to work there. They were acquired by the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. And Phenomic AI is a company I started based on my PhD, focused on improving drug discovery with machine learning applied to cell biology images. And with that, I'd like to hand it off to Rafi to talk more about Mars.
So now I feel like Michael Jackson because I have a warmer. Thank you so much. So I don't know if the organizer will allow us to be a little improvisational, but if we have a few minutes, how about towards the end of my lecture, I ask both Oren and Sheldon to take 30 seconds of elevator pitch and see how you do in terms of getting ready for the real deal. So I have to assume that Bill, what's his name? Bill Daly, rather, and Bill and Terry are not in the room. I can see them. But they made a very interesting comment during the panel earlier today, which is that in their mind, the vision is that every student will have an AI-driven mentor. Where were you guys when I was a student 40 years ago? So I subscribe to what they said. AI is certainly the future. And my role this part of the day is to demonstrate to you how we created the ecosystem in Canada, in Toronto, to enable all the futuristic ideas that were discussed during the day. So I'm not going to talk about any of the specifics because you heard quite a bit, and I'm sure that you will hear more. I want to describe to you why Canada, and the first answer to that is why not? The other way to describe it is by virtue of a very special approach we took about how we create an ecosystem that turns into an engine of AI and machine learning for human society as we move into a better future. So by the way, I have to say that I'm not Jeff Hinton, just in case you wonder, but I am from Toronto. And since I am from Toronto, I think I'm qualified to tell you a little bit about the ecosystem. So what are the attributes of Toronto in general terms that everybody gets excited, at least I do? Number one, the economists suggested that it's one of the safest, or actually number one from safety. It's always nice to do AI in a safe place, and so that's why Toronto. It's the number 4 largest city in North America, and it's growing. And it's number 2 in North America for financial activity. So everybody talks about Wall Street, but when you come to Toronto, those of you who've been there will recognize the fact that between a street called College Street and the waterfront, which is the waterfront of the lake, not of the ocean, there's probably anywhere between $1 and $5 trillion. So that's why it's next to Wall Street, one of the largest turbines for financial activities. Having said it, and based on what Oren already told you, when we talk about the direction that everybody wants to take, whether it's fintech, based on the banking activities in downtown Toronto, and healthcare, which is everything that happens in the medical centers of Toronto, you understand that we have foundational elements for that. The other reason why it's nice to be Toronto is because it's not too far from New York. So when you finally cross the Atlantic, by the way, I can tell you based on my experience of last night, about 13 hours this direction and 15 on the other direction, you are very close to New York. By the way, Toronto has a downtown airport, Billy Bishop Airport. Takes less than an hour to travel from Toronto to New York and back. Make sure that you come back at the same day because you want to be in Toronto. So if I were to tell you about all the successes over the years, it will probably take us till midnight, but I want to just point out maybe one or two. I don't know if the slides are available to everybody. As far as I'm concerned, it should be available to you so that you can review them at your leisure. So just maybe one or two. I don't know if you're aware of it, but insulin was discovered in Toronto in 1921. Chris Yip is here from the University of Toronto. He can tell you the entire story of how Benting and Best came about the discovery. Insulin is probably one of the leading drugs for human society. Then, where is somewhere here the fact that stem cells have been discovered in Toronto in the 60s. And last but not least, for those of you who pay more attention to electronics, you may recall that BlackBerry, before iPhone, before Android, it came out of Ontario, which is in Waterloo, next to Toronto. And it goes on, it gets better and better. All it comes to show is that you have the right ecosystem which allows everybody to be very creative, very innovative, and that's why paying attention to Toronto makes a lot of sense. So, if it's so nice and dandy, as they say in California, why do we need to come up with more and better approaches to enablement, to acceleration? The answer is that a lot is going on in academic institutions, in Canada, in the United States, and in the rest of the world. However, we all have to agree that between academic research and discovery-based idea and reality that becomes useful, and I understand that many industrialists in the room, there is a very challenging, what we call valley of death. And to be able to overcome that challenging element, in Toronto, we created a very strong engine called Mars Innovation. I happen to be President and CEO of Mars Innovation. It's made of, so I mentioned your name, Professor Daly. I asked the question, where were you 40 years ago when I was a student and needed a mentor?
At MIT.
Oh, I see. That explains it. At any rate, to be able to maximize the potential, 15 institutions in downtown Toronto got together. This is University of Toronto, the 9 teaching hospitals that are affiliated to the university, Ryerson University, York, and a few research institutions, and now add to it Vector Institute, that is the new and coming fancy organization for AI studies. All of them got together to create a stronghold of what we call in our jargon a central tech transfer office, which is Mars Innovation. Quickly to tell you, U of T is one of the 20 among the Ivy Leagues of the world. Everybody knows it by now. The hospitals belong to the leaders. UHN is probably strong in certain areas, certainly in oncology, and we could talk a lot about elements of AI-driven activities. Sick kids is probably number 2 or number 3 for pediatric medicine. Much more important than that is that Canada's federal government and the provincial government are very strongly committed to research. Just in Ontario, this slide is not updated, close to $2 billion annually goes into research. Very promising, very encouraging ideas have to come when you are so well funded. Back to the challenge, as I said before. Great ideas at the left-hand side, which is ideation. Everybody talks about acceleration, incubation, and beyond. Between this and that, admittedly, undeniably, there is what we describe as valley of death. Why is it the valley of death? Because in the academic setting, we talk about great ideas. I just heard people mention the conference in Montreal next week. Many more ideas, new ideas will come up. But now the question is, what will it take to activate or to materialize them or to operationalize them beyond the valley of death? And that is Mars innovation. If I have to describe in one word, we are the bridge over the chasm, over the valley of death. And everything else happens and beyond it. And there's a punchline. Stay to the end of my presentation for that. So, when I was young and promising, the way to do this stuff was to put a nice glossy page, describe the idea, send it to whomever, say Apple, if Apple were there, probably not, ask them to develop the product and start sending royalties back to us. The paradigm in tech transfer has changed. Now they send the page back to me and say, Hofstein, keep going, very interesting. At the time that you have a much more advanced product, we will buy it from you, and then we will pay royalties. And to be able to address this challenging element, we decided to take a different approach, which is an approach of creating startup companies. I'm trying to be fast because I promised Sheldon and Oren 30 seconds of elevator pitch just to demonstrate how we go about it. So we have now in our portfolio a bunch of companies, all very young, but all very promising. Just a few stats. What's nice about the fact that you have a central office is, first and foremost, you have a deal flow. Rather than having, so I don't know what the deal flow is for Stanford these days, but I can tell you that when you combine them all together, it's in the hundreds annually. So over the years, we saw many great, promising ideas. We cannot fund all of them, so we did the cherry pick, admittedly. We now have 100 projects under management. Of them, more than half turned into startups that are in our portfolio. The reason people pay attention to office like mine is because they know that seed funding is something that we do, and we do day in and day out. So we invested over the years over $20 million in these little startups. Small amounts, but very meaningful at a risky stage that no one else is prepared to do that. What's nice about that seed investment is that it drew the attention of the rest of the world being the world of investors. And I have to tell you that it's not a simple thing in Canadian terms. Maybe in California, everybody knows that venture capital industry is always very active, and next to it, angel investor industry is very active. For Canada, this is relatively new. And yet, it grew exponentially in a relatively period of time. $250 million into a whole array of startup companies that were introduced to the world. We are funded by the government, so the government wants to know that we do something useful for the economy. And I can tell you that just by virtue of this portfolio, we already created 400 jobs, good jobs, and growing. please pay attention to the right-hand side of the slide, because this is fairly new for us. What you see here is 27 company, actually now it's up to 35, which is called UTest. UTest holds for University of Toronto Early Stage Technologies. So if you are young, bright, and promising like Oren, who was on stage a few minutes ago, and has a great idea which turns into Phenomic AI, someone has to pay attention to him. Someone has to do the hand-holding while he's struggling with transformation from an academic setting into an industrial setting. So UTest is a virtual incubator that we started several years ago, and the way it works is handshake between Mars Innovation, my company, and University of Toronto. Each of us contributes $25,000 into each of these companies, small amounts of money, but the highest risk possible. And the reason it's workable is because with a $50,000 and a lot of attention, after about a year or two, you can demonstrate to the world that you have a legitimate prototype, a prototype that every investor wants to invest in. And it really works, and it works very well. So here comes the punchline. We've been here for almost 4 years now. And I try to come at least twice a year, and I enjoy it immensely. I have to tell you, I started thinking that I saw that BioKorea is in April. So I might stay here between now and then because it's still 2 degrees centigrade while it's minus 20 in Toronto. Is that okay with you? Yes, no? My choice, right? Okay. So at any rate, we'll be back. However, the point I want to make is that we came regularly. And after a number of years, we realized that there is a huge potential for collaboration between Canada in general, Toronto in particular, and Korean partners. And we already have 10 very active, lively cooperations between scientists from this side of the ocean and the other side of the ocean. What is the problem? Here again, the problem is that when we start seeing the buds growing, there is the need for capital. And there is a need for capital at a very early stage, at a very risky stage of the business. And therefore, together with colleagues here in Seoul, we started talking about a seed fund, a South Korean, Toronto-based seed fund that will be a global fund. And when I come next year, I hope to be able to tell you, A, that it's up and running, and B, that it started funding. Do I have time for Sheldon and where's the organizer? Do I have time for them? Okay, Sheldon, 30 seconds, go. And if you're not impressed, don't invest in him.
So my name's Sheldon. I'm the CEO of Bird 7. We're actually one of the companies that developed outside of the hospital. There's a lot of hospitals and AI research that happens around there. Our company is really focused on enabling any hospital in the world to deliver even the most complex radiation treatments. We really focus on some of the complexities that every single patient that's getting one of these treatments, you have to look at the images and figure out what exactly the patient has. You have to figure out how to deliver the dosages of radiation to it. So we allow any hospital, no matter the type of resources they do have or don't have, to give the best plans, like a center in Toronto that deals with tens of thousands of patients.
Bravo.
Maybe it would be appropriate if you come a little bit to the center so that everybody
Sorry?
can see. Maybe you can come up a little bit to the center so that everybody
He's
can
too
see.
shy.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Rafi. So I'm Oren, CEO and founder of Phenomic AI. So we're a company that came out of the University of Toronto Machine Learning Group. And the core technology we developed enables finding better drugs faster. So we apply computer vision to drug screens that are tested in cell lines based on imaging. And then we let the machine learning algorithms, like the deep learning algorithms, pick out which drugs are working the best. And because we're so confident in this approach, we actually opened up our own experimental lab, and we're actually trying to discover drugs ourselves using that technique. Thanks.
Very good. So just to wrap it up, one last final comment. During the day, we met with a few groups. We tell them about drug discovery. They ask about big data in healthcare. We tell them about big data in healthcare. They ask about transportation. And then they ask about fintech. The answer is that we have all of the above, and it's growing. The reason I say that is because Canada decided to take a lead position in the space. And when you talk about lead position, you wonder how much money is put behind it. And the total amount of money is over $500 million. And now, you probably heard during the day, there is one center in Montreal, one in Toronto, one in Edmonton, all of whom are the initial effort towards a growing economy, and you're all invited to participate in the party. Thank you very much. Questions?
Shall we now open the floor for some questions?
Happy to.
네, 혹시 질문 있으시면 받아보도록 하겠습니다. 지금 한국에서의 파트너를 찾고 있고 시드 펀드가 결국에는 글로벌 벤처 펀드로 나아갈 수 있다라는 이야기를 해주셨습니다. 질문 있으신 분 손 들어주시면 저희가 마이크 전달해드리겠습니다. 네, 한국도 역시 스타트업에 대한 열기가 뜨거운 곳인데요. 저희 인공지능 관련 스타트업에 대한 이야기 들어봤습니다. I guess people are shy to ask questions.
No questions.
Ask the floor.
Any questions?
Okay. 네, 그럼 저희 이것으로 발표 마무리하도록 하겠습니다. Thank you very
Okay,
much.
if you have questions, we are a group of 6 people strong. Lincoln, Tony, myself, Sheldon, Oren, and whether Chris. Is Chris in the room? He's around. So ask all the questions and we will try to have answers. Thank you so much.
네, 지금 바로 질문을 못 하시는 분들은 이따가 또 6분이 계시는 이 마스 이노베이션에 대해서 추후에 또 질문해 주시면 감사하겠습니다.